My name is Ryland Doerr. As president of the National Security Law Association at The Ohio State University's Moritz College of Law, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, 9/11 at 20, reflecting on the attack and 20 years of the post-9/11 era. We are honored to welcome our esteemed speakers to revisit the surreal shock of September 11th, 2001, and provide analysis on the subsequent war on terror as it enters a new phase with the recent withdrawal from Afghanistan. I want to give special thanks to the Moritz College of Law and the Mershon Center for organizing this event, and I will now turn this over to one of the event's organizers, Professor Dakota Rudisil.
Good morning. My name is Dakota Rudisil. I'm a law professor here at The Ohio State University. On behalf of the Mershon Center for International Security Studies, welcome to today's conference on 9/11 at 20, reflecting on the attack and 20 years of the post-9/11 era. September 11 was the most impactful single moment in global and national affairs since Pearl Harbor. 9/11 changed everything for so many. It hugely shaped the world inhabited by our current Ohio State students, most of whom on that day were very young or not yet born. In recent weeks, all of us have watched the ragged end of the US military presence in Afghanistan, which started as one of 9/11's first consequences. Today, we will explore 9/11 and its implications in 4 sessions. Moving in reverse order, our 4th panel today at 2:40 p.m. will explore 9/11's legal legacy. Our 3rd session at 1:40 p.m. will explore 9/11 in terms of violence management, prevention, and recovery from violence. Our 2nd panel at 2:05 p.m. will focus on 9/11's cultural, strategic, and political impacts. Our 1st session, beginning now, will ground September 11 in personal experience. In the interest of presenting an array of memories in the time we have, these 10 recollections were gathered in advance. We'll begin our 9/11 conference's 1st session now, starting with a key person in NORAD's early warning network that day, General Bob Kehler.
I'm General Bob Kehler, retired from the United States Air Force on the 1st of January of 2014. When I retired, I was the commander of United States Strategic Command in Omaha, Nebraska. I was a young brigadier general in command of the 21st Space Wing on September 11th of 2001. So on the morning of 9/11, the 21st Space Wing was already on a simulated wartime footing. My operations center was fully manned with a battle staff and our entire complement of operations and support people, and we were in 24/7 operations. And of course, everything changed at what for us was the significant time of 6:46 and 30 seconds in the morning Mountain Time. I was about to leave my house to attend the changeover briefing in my operations center, and we were anticipating another day of exercise and inspection activities. And I did what I almost always did before I left my quarters. I turned on the television, and CNN was just reporting what they were calling unconfirmed reports that a plane had crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center. So I paused for a minute and I kept watching, and the first live pictures started to appear on the television. And interestingly, my first thoughts were not about national security. I grew up in a household with a father who was an elected official in our small city, and his job was director of public safety. He was the fire commissioner. And so I grew up around firefighters and emergency responders my entire life. And the first thing I thought about was that 30 floors of the World Trade Center were on fire. That's the equivalent of a 30-story building on fire on top of a 70-story building. It was incredible. The amount of damage and fire that you could see in a very short amount of time suggested to me that we weren't talking about some little commuter airplane that had gone astray here. And the second thing I noted was it was a crystal clear day. Back in the 40s, an Army bomber crashed into the Empire State Building, but it was in dense fog. It was before all the air traffic control mechanisms that we have today and other things. And so I thought to myself, something unusual was happening here. Something unusual had to have happened in order for that to occur. I headed to my operations center. I told the duty watch to display CNN on the screens in our operations center. So we started to talk about this, and we talked about whether or not it could be an accident. But I also asked our intelligence collection section to get on their networks and find out if anything was being reported. And the answer was nothing. there was nothing being reported. There was no sense that there was an imminent threat or some other ongoing attack. We thought that this was a one and done kind of an event, perhaps. And some of us discussed the possibility of it being a terrorist attack, recalling that the World Trade Center had been hit by terrorists in 1993 with a bomb down in the parking garage. So we were watching live when the second plane hit the South Tower, and it was at 7:03 and 2 seconds Mountain Time. And at that point, there was no doubt. We knew the country was under attack. So on my authority, I ordered an increase in force protection for our base and the units under my command. I told the Inspector General that we were no longer going to be participating in an inspection or exercises. We were switching to real world responses. And again, as we were watching, at 37 minutes after 7, Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon. And when the television cut to the burning Pentagon, my vice wing commander, a colonel, turned to me and said, "People that we know might be dead right now." And it began to dawn on all of us that what we thought was a horrific event with both of the Trade Center towers being hit was now something completely different, that the nation was under attack in more than one location. And that began to shape how we conducted ourselves really for the rest of the day. Shortly after that, our higher headquarters began to issue orders to increase our force protection. We closed our bases to all but essential personnel. We put maximum protection posture in place with barricades and street closures and sandbag bunkers at the entry points and patrols and dogs and basically every security asset that we had, and all of the base defense plans that we had practiced for years and years and years, but had never actually done for real. After 8, almost 9 o'clock, the Secretary of Defense ordered U.S. forces worldwide to Defense Condition 3, which moved us from a simulated wartime footing to a real wartime footing. But it was for the wrong war. We knew who we weren't at war with. What we didn't know was who we were at war with. And so we sat there in tremendous frustration as 6,000 people and billions of dollars worth of hardware could do nothing to stop the attacks that were underway. And early that evening, I left the command center to visit some of our security and other posts. And it was eerie because Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs shares the runways with Colorado Springs Airport. And it's not a huge airport, but it's a busy airport, a civilian airport. And there was no commercial air traffic, no taxiing aircraft, and even more eerie, no traffic visible in the air, because that's really unusual. That part of Colorado sits under some of the busiest cross-country air routes, and you can always see traffic almost any time of the day or night. But the only traffic we saw in the air was when the F-16s that were flying combat air patrol over Denver and Colorado Springs came over in their racetrack patterns. They were doing a big oval from Colorado Springs up the front range of the Rockies, around Denver and back down, and they just continued to make that racetrack over and over and over. And the only military aircraft on the ramp were several KC-135 refueling tankers that were getting more gas so that they could get up and resume their support to the fighter caps. So the rest of that day passed in silence. We were frustrated that we couldn't find or strike an enemy that we didn't know and couldn't see. And all of us realized, I think, that our world had changed irrevocably. And that's now 20 years ago. And we're still seeing the impact of that change.
My name is Ashley Watson, and I was a 6th grader in Toledo, Ohio, when 9/11 happened.
And I'm Major General Mark Bartman, retired United States Air Force. And at the time at 9/11, I was the operations officer for the 112 Fighter Squadron at Toledo Express Airport, and Ashley's dad.
As a 6th grader, I was actually 2 days from turning 12. My birthday's on September 13th. So that morning was, I think, probably just excited about my birthday coming up. And then all of a sudden, all of the principal came by our classroom and kind of whispered some things to our teacher, and the adults seemed very kind of freaked out about what was happening, and they turned on all the TVs. We stopped all of our classwork. Everyone in the whole school stopped learning and turned on their TVs and started watching. And I remember being very confused about what was happening. It was almost like watching a movie, like as an 11-year-old, I didn't understand that this was real life, I guess. You just see all these news reports and planes crashing into buildings. And we turned on the TV before the second plane hit. So we saw that happen with the news. And there was this one guy in my class who was kind of like a prankster. And he said, "Those darn terrorists." And our teacher got so mad. And we were all like, why is our teacher so mad? We're so confused about, like the gravity of this situation. And I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, I need to tell my dad, like this is important information for him as a military person. Like there's planes involved. He's a pilot. He needs to know. So I remember my mom picking me up at the end of the day. And I was like, Mom, we need to tell Dad that something happened with the planes and the towers. And she was like, he's on top of it. But then throughout the rest of the year, we just did all these projects about 9/11. And I really don't think that I ever internalized how big of an event it was until perhaps this year when we had the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. And I think the reaction that I had to that was probably how a lot of adults were feeling when 9/11 was happening. So that's kind of how I can relate to it now. But as an 11-year-old, I just really had no idea what was happening, was very confused about the gravity of the situation and just thought this guy here really needed to know. So I'll turn it over to him. I'm sure he had a very different day.
Yeah, so it started out, obviously as a beautiful Tuesday morning in Toledo, Ohio, blue sky. We had actually not too long ago, because normally the way that you work in training in the fighter community is you have 2 launches. So you have a morning go and an afternoon go where groups of fighters will take off and go do training and then come back. And then you have that break during the lunch period. But the unique thing about that Tuesday morning is that we had staff meetings every Tuesday. So the wing commander at the time and the other commanders on the base, we had started our staff meeting about at 8:30 that morning. And so, the first plane obviously went into the towers around 8:46, I remember. And it was shortly after that, one of our chief master sergeants who runs our life support shop came blasting through the door of the conference room that we were in, and which first of all was, that was like unusual, right? Nobody opens in the middle of a staff meeting when everybody knows that all the commanders are in the room and that they're in there talking about what should be important things, right? And so his name was Mo Manarson. And so Mo blasts come to the door and he just looks at us with this terrified look on his face and says, "You have to come out and look at the TV now." And we're all kind of like looking at each other going, "Mo, what on earth are you talking about? Chief, what's going on?" He says, "No, you have to come out and look at the TV right now." And so we all went out and we had, a small flat screen TV that was out near our operations counter. And we went out and we all stood around it. And of course, we're watching now live coverage as to what's going on. And then the second plane hits, the tower. And about that time, I get a call from Northeast Air Defense Command. And so you have to remember, right, at that time, in fact, this came out in the 9/11 Commission afterwards, which I'm sure, will probably be a point of discussion, but is that, the military and the Department of Defense and pretty much most of the US government was not concerned particularly with internal threats, right? It was all about external. And so the only alert aircraft that were sitting alert at that time were what we used to call the Four Corners. So there was a unit in Florida, one in Massachusetts, one in Oregon, one in California, that generally sort of patrolled the coast to make sure that if there was anybody that was going to attack the United States from the Atlantic or the Pacific or over the North Pole region, that they would be the ones to do the defense of that. So as a fighter unit in Toledo, we were not capable of being able to respond with any kind of ordnance. So we never flew with live missiles. The only live ammunition we would ever fly with would be the 20 millimeter Gatling gun that was internal to the F-16. And that was when we were going to air to ground ranges to do practice, right? So it only had what we would call training munition in the bullets. So I get this call from Northeast Air Defense Command, and it's not even really a senior individual. It was somebody from the floor, and I'm the one, the person working behind our ops counter hands me the phone and says, "This person wants to talk to somebody about launching aircraft." And I'm like, okay. So I take the phone and they say, I was Lieutenant Colonel at the time. They say, Colonel, you have to get aircraft airborne immediately. And I was like, okay, under whose authority are you directing me to launch aircraft? Because again, we're not alert unit, right? That's not what we did. Our primary mission was air to ground type stuff. And so so after this conversation going back and forth a little bit, I said, okay, so what is our ROE? So what are the rules of engagement, right? Going to be if my fighters encounter somebody airborne that we need to do something with? And the response was, we have no idea. There is no ROE right now, just get airborne. I was like, okay, interesting. So I put down the phone, I walk around the corner of the operations building, and about that time, it was probably closer to 10 o'clock by now. Our first go had just landed and two of the pilots were walking towards me down the hallway. And I looked at him and I said, turn around, go back out and get in your jets and take off. And of course, their reaction was the same as mine was why? And I said, I don't have all the details. Just get back out to your airplanes. We'll get gas in them and take off and go. So the first jets that we actually got airborne, time-wise, had Flight 90, United Flight 93 continued westbound. Let's say if maybe the plan was to go after Chicago or something like that. There might have been a possibility that those first two guys that we got airborne could have potentially intercepted that aircraft. But again, they would have intercepted it with nothing other than just themselves potentially to try to figure out a way to stop, this airliner. So of course, as it was, the passengers on board, found out what was going on, and eventually the aircraft ended up crashing in Pennsylvania. But that whole day from that point forward, as you can imagine, was almost surreal in the way things went down for that. It was almost like you were in some sort of a strange movie that things were going on. I had guys coming back, and so for the rest of the day, we would continue to launch two aircraft as frequently as we could. Some of them went as far west as Chicago, and they ended up flying caps over Chicago. Some of them stayed in the Ohio and kind of Western Pennsylvania area. Some went as far south as Cincinnati to cover some of those areas. But, as this is going on, right, and the FAA figures out that all civilian aircraft need to be grounded. So all the planes are landing. My guys are coming back from these flights and they're saying, hey, we're talking to, the FAA controllers and nobody knows what's going on. We still have at this point, this was by noon, we still have no rules of engagement as to what we're supposed to be doing. At one point, one of my groups of flights came back and they had been talking to Cleveland Center, one of the air traffic control facilities up in Cleveland. And they were told that the Cleveland Center individuals thought that potentially they were going to be attacked by a suicide aircraft bomber. And so they basically told my pilots, they said, hey, you guys are on your own, do whatever you want to do. We're evacuating the building. And they did. And so for about an hour, I had two F-16s flying around Northern Ohio under no control, talking to nobody other than each other. So you can imagine, that was some of the crazy things that kind of went on during that day. At one point, I had two of my F-16s that intercepted a guy out crop dusting a field. And the reports we got back, of course, much later, as we went through all of the after action on this, was the individual couldn't figure out what on earth was going on, why he had these F-16s that kept buzzing him, but that was because, we had been told that all civilian aircraft had to be on the ground immediately.
It's been 2 decades since the horrific attacks of 9/11, but the memory of that day and the memories of those we lost still remain with us. On September 11th, we all remember where we were. I was serving in Congress representing the Cincinnati area. That morning, I organized a meeting at the West Wing of the White House with several House colleagues and some senior officials in the Bush administration. My wife, Jane Portman, was in D.C. for a rare visit, so she came with me to the White House that morning. When the first plane hit the World Trade Center in New York City, a Bush aide interrupted our meeting and asked me to come upstairs to the Chief of Staff's office. He said there seemed to have been a terrible accident. As we walked into the office, we saw on TV that another plane hit the second tower, and we knew this was no accident. We were under attack. President Bush was in Sarasota, Florida, but the White House staff went into action. I saw the Deputy National Security Advisor for Chemical, Biological, and Nuclear Weapons, who I'd recently been on a panel with, rush into the West Wing and head for the Situation Room. What went through my mind when I saw her was the possibility that one or more of these weapons of mass destruction might have been used. As we hurriedly left the West Wing of the White House, just before it was evacuated, we could see an ominous plume of black smoke coming from the direction of the Pentagon. We turned on the car radio and heard about the attack on the Pentagon and the possibility of another plane coming to Washington, D.C. We were mostly concerned about our 3 young children who were back home in Cincinnati. I thought it was important to stay in Washington to do my job, but we wanted to get Jane home as soon as possible to be with our kids and other family. Rental cars were already really hard to find, but we got the last car at an enterprise rental agency in the suburbs and Jane headed home. On her way back, somewhere in Pennsylvania, Jane called me to say a group of first responders from Ohio Task Force 1 out of Southwest Ohio passed her, going the other direction, going east, lights flashing. We had a few friends who were part of that group. Here they were, driving into harm's way to help search for survivors at Ground Zero in New York City. God bless them and all Americans who showed extraordinary bravery in the face of adversity. The firefighters, police officers, and everyday citizens who stepped forward and risked their lives for others. Others donated blood, sent contributions, or extended a hand to a neighbor in need. Many of us knew someone affected directly by those cowardly terrorist attacks 20 years ago. And my thoughts and prayers go out today to my fellow Americans who continue to mourn the loss of a loved one because of that tragic day. Every September 11th, since 2011, I've made it a point to reach out to some of those Ohio families who lost someone in those attacks. The fight to protect our country from terrorism continues today. There are still evil terrorists out there who dedicate themselves to ending our way of life. We must always express our appreciation for our brave servicemen and women who have served or continue to serve in the war on terror. Their tireless efforts have protected us here at home and abroad. With the recent events in Afghanistan, I want all of our veterans of the war on terror and their families to know that their sacrifice was not in vain. They fought the enemy on foreign soil, so we didn't have to fight them here, and they helped us to avoid enduring another event like 9/11. On behalf of a grateful nation, thank you for your service, thank you for your sacrifice, and may God bless you and God bless the United States of America.
My name is Madeline Creeden. At the time, on, Monday, September 11th, or September 10th, I was working for the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I was on the staff. We had spent a very long night in the office on Monday, and so I'd gotten home quite late. And Tuesday morning, which was the 11th, my son was a sophomore in high school, got him off, got my husband off, and was taking my time to leave. And I had the Today Show on and heard that at that point, what they thought was a small plane had crashed into the first tower. So I finished up and I got in the car. It was a spectacularly gorgeous day. I had a convertible, put the top down, headed off to work. And I called my sister. My sister lived in Lower Manhattan on Broadway down by the New York City Hall. And she worked in the shorter of the 3 trade towers. And when she went to work, she walked down the street and she walked through the plaza for towers 1 and 2 to get to her building, which is in the shorter one. So I got in the car and I called her. And just as she answered the phone, the news came on again that a second plane had struck the tower. Now, luckily, she was home. Otherwise, she would have been walking, at some point, she would have been walking through that plaza as at least probably the first plane was hitting. But she was supposed to go out of town, so she was home. So she was fine. So I'm in the car, we're talking. I live in Alexandria. I'm driving up 395, which is, as you know, the main road to go over the 14th Street Bridge to get to the Capitol building. But you have to pass the Pentagon. And as I'm passing the Pentagon, I heard what sounded like a plane that was too low, kind of over my left shoulder, and sort of thought, well, that's odd, but kept on going. And by the time I got to the Senate Armed Services Committee offices, which were in the Russell Senate office building, which is directly across the street from the Capitol, as I was going in, the Capitol Hill police were all saying, the Pentagon's been hit, the Pentagon's been hit, and got to the office. And at that point, they had then discovered that the fourth plane was still in the air. They knew it had been hijacked. And the speculation was that it was coming for the Capitol building. There wasn't a good evacuation process back then in the Senate office buildings of the Capitol. And so the Capitol Police were pretty much going door to door and pounding on doors and saying, leave, leave, leave. And as we went out the door, so we're like, well, what's going on? Walked out the door. Luckily, I grabbed my purse and my car keys, walked out the door. And at that point, they all just said, run, not where, just run. So several of us, because by then you could also see the plume of smoke coming from the Pentagon. So several of us went to a restaurant right in back of the Dirksen Senate office building called the Monocle. Old restaurant, been there for years. And it turned out that turned out to be a gathering place for both a lot of senators and a lot of staff, because there was really nowhere else to go. So I recall sitting in what was sort of the bar area of the Monocle at that point, and they had the television on. And I was sitting at a table with Senator Pat Roberts, who was the Republican senator from Kansas, and, sort of talking about what was going on, watching the news. And at that point, we saw the first tower collapse. Well, of course, nobody's cell phone was working at that point. So I couldn't get hold of my daughter on my cell phone. I couldn't get hold of my son. I couldn't get hold of anybody.
So I'm Alan Cohen. I'm a partner at the law firm of Sept and Johnson in Washington, D.C. On 9/11, I was also working as an attorney in Washington, D.C. But at the time, I was also a member of the Fairfax County Urban Search and Rescue Task Force and a disaster assistance employee, essentially a reservist for FEMA's Urban Search and Rescue Program. There's few words to describe what it was like seeing that site, especially in 1993 when we responded. Our convoy of ambulances and response vehicles came down the FDR Drive on the east side of Manhattan. We went down underneath Battery Park and came out right by the Trade Center. And it was a mass of emergency vehicles and fire officers and police officers directing people to response vehicles to where they needed to go, triage officers, lines of ambulances, ordered kind of activity. 9/11 was nothing like that. In the first days when coordinating from DC, it was very difficult to establish efficient communications and to establish trust, as the top level of officials were gone and we were dealing with unfamiliar people who were overwhelmed and who knew what would happen next. Up at the Trade Center, it was very difficult. It was difficult to see. It was a difficult time because everyone was trying to focus on the task at hand, but the task was so overwhelming that it was difficult to effectively and efficiently integrate all the resources that were there. But it was also really inspiring. Again, riding down the West Side Highway, seeing people on the streets just cheering and supporting rescue workers, to see the level of desire to help, to be involved in whatever way that people could, even if it meant gathering equipment, even if it meant donating supplies, even if it meant just trying to have a human interaction with people as they went to go try to conduct this very difficult job was really inspiring. And of course, it was horrifying to see the posters on the street with the missing signs, say, you know, and families looking for their loved ones, trying to find out if firefighters and police officers who we had worked with in the urban search and rescue program had survived or had died like Chief Downey did. It was an overwhelming experience, both from the scope and scale of the destruction and its kind of physical and psychological impact, but also in the inspiring level of unity and of just desire of people to pull together. And the resilience that was shown was unbelievable and remarkable. The only other thing I would add is that I think 9/11 showed us that as a nation, we're resilient. We're capable of putting aside our differences and uniting towards a common goal and supporting and helping each other. And I think we need to think about doing more for each other and our communities now, not just in the face of catastrophe. Join a volunteer fire department, volunteer to ride an ambulance, help strengthen your community. Because we have to be careful that external events, terrorist attacks, natural disasters, pandemics don't divide us when what we most need is a common purpose towards the common good.
My name is Michael Hurley, and on September 11, 2001, I was CIA operations officer. Case officers is another name for that category of work at CIA, and I was a senior manager in charge of an office of about 400 people at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia.
What was your experience of 9/11 and the days and weeks that followed?
So I was managing this rather large group of people at CIA headquarters when people were able to watch CNN and other, sort of news outlets on their computer screens, and people often did that to stay up on breaking news as they were doing their work. And a few of the people that I was the manager of kind of rushed into my office and said, "Mike, you've got to see this." So I went out and went to one of their computer monitors, and I saw that there was this gaping hole in one of the towers of the World Trade Center. And they said that a commercial aircraft, a large one, had just crashed into it. And we immediately thought, well, how could that happen? I mean, how could a pilot make such a huge error? And it seemed like this terrible thing. And then while we were watching, 20 minutes later or so, the next aircraft slammed into the other tower. And we knew instantly that this was a terrorist attack at that point. There had to be some plan behind this, and the day unfolded after that. But what happened was that you may remember that there were threats coming in for all over Washington. Nobody knew what was likely to happen next. President Bush was actually down in Florida. I think he was there speaking to an elementary school, I think, making this visit. And there were threats against the State Department, for example. The FAA grounded every commercial aircraft in the country, of which there are thousands in the air at any given time. And so there was this kind of chaos and mayhem going on. Nobody knew how many aircraft had been hijacked. And so people sort of feared the worst. Eventually, a plane slammed into the Pentagon in Northern Virginia. And another plane was the one that appeared to be, we later learned, was headed towards the Capitol, US Capitol, or the White House. And that was the one where the passengers took action and tried to take over the cockpit of United 93. So that was going on. CIA managers, the top managers, believed that CIA headquarters building could be a target that morning. And so they issued orders to evacuate the building. And this was a very rare occurrence, and it actually led to traffic jams on the highways kind of leading out of that building as people left. But they requested that what were known as essential employees stay on the job, and essential employees being people that really had to continue their work because of the problems that could ensue if they were away. So people that had to stay in touch with, for example, other agency personnel overseas are doing very sensitive things. And I was one of those essential employees. Interestingly, also, the entire counter-terrorist center of CIA was deemed obviously that day as all essential employees. I think there were somewhere between 150 and 200 people working in the counter-terrorist center. And they had been the ones that had been responsible for trying to develop intelligence on Al-Qaeda before the 9/11 attacks, and also coming up with the covert operations to capture or kill Osama bin Laden and his principal deputies before the 9/11 attacks, and also preventing sort of any terrorist attack from Sunni extremist groups. And so they all stayed, and within 2 hours they had identified the 19 hijackers, and they had identified them as Al-Qaeda, which was important information to know that immediately right away. So that afternoon, I then, still being in the building, walked over to the counter-terrorist center where I knew one of the senior managers, and I volunteered to go to Afghanistan that afternoon. It took them about 7 or 8 weeks to get me to Afghanistan. So I reported the next day after the 9/11 attacks to the counter-terrorist center, just sort of left the job that I was in as a senior manager and went in to begin working against Al-Qaeda on a number of different fronts from the headquarters. And CIA put initially 7 teams on the ground. The first team that hit the ground was I think a little bit more than 2 weeks after the 9/11 attacks, which was, showed some stunning agility, I think, to go into that environment. And then 7 teams placed in strategic parts of the country, all which lashed up with friendly Afghan militias. And their job was to go out and capture or kill Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and to develop locational information on where these enemies of the United States were. So, and I think it's important for people to know that the person who led the first team on the ground in Afghanistan for CIA, and these teams were comprised of agency personnel, undercover operators, but also special forces from the US military. But they were very small groups. But the first team was led by a CIA officer who was 61 years old. And he went in, and it's a pretty amazing story because, you think, well, why are you deploying a 61-year-old? Well, the reason was that he had more experience in Afghanistan and in Pakistan than probably anybody else in the United States government. He had been chief of station in Islamabad during the Soviet period in Afghanistan and running Mujahideen against the Soviet interests there. And then he'd been chief of station in Kabul. So he knew he could speak Dari and Pashto, the 2 principal languages in the region. He knew the cultures, and he knew a lot of the people, a lot of the Afghan leaders that had assisted us during the period when the Soviets were there. So his name is Gary Schroen, and he wrote a book about leading that first team into Afghanistan called First In, which is an interesting read. The first teams that we put on the ground, the CIA only kept its people in Afghanistan for a maximum of 6 weeks because, given the danger of the environment that they were in and the pressure and stress that they were under, that was thought to be pretty much all they could take before they needed to come back to the States or go to some place that wasn't a war zone like Afghanistan was. So that's what I was doing on the day of the 9/11 attacks and the days after.
My name is Dakota Rudisil, and I'm a law professor at Ohio State. On Tuesday, September 11, 2001, I was a U.S. Senate staff member in the Capitol complex. I handled national defense and international affairs spending for the Senate Budget Committee and was National Security Policy Advisor to the chairman, Senator Kent Conrad. The radio reported the first plane hitting the World Trade Center as I descended into the underground parking ramp. After the second plane hit the second tower and the Pentagon was hit, we evacuated our offices in the Senate Russell Building, which is across the street from the Capitol building. In the hallway, I saw colleagues from the Senate Intelligence Committee running for the exit. I ran too. We emerged into the park just north of the Capitol. There, we waited in horror for that shining temple to democracy in front of us to suffer the same fate as the Twin Towers. A news crew set up their cameras on the roof of another building. They had a perfect view. It was a beautiful day. Communications were poor. We had little quality information. Keep in mind, this was before smartphones or even camera phones, so we had no internet and nobody I knew took any pictures. The cell phones we had were mostly useless because the cell networks were overwhelmed. We briefly got through to Senator Conrad. He was in his Senate office and refusing, on principle, to leave. He refused to be terrified by terrorists. I was very worried about his safety and the ability of our government to function if leaders were killed. I also respected his resolve. Standing in the park, we heard that the South Tower had collapsed. How many lives had just been lost? Then we heard a concussive boom. Rumors swirled of a car bomb at the State Department. In reality, it was probably a sonic boom from an F-16 going supersonic, racing to protect Washington. Like the fighter jet pilots, we had heard that there were additional hijacked jetliners inbound. We would not know it for several hours, but because of a lucky combination of a normal ground delay at Newark Airport, airphones on the planes, and extraordinary bravery, the passengers of Flight 93 had learned about the attacks and fought the hijackers. En route to the White House, or probably the Capitol, Flight 93 had already crashed near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. We could not go back to the office, and there's no point in standing around next to an obvious target, so folks started to leave the park. With the roads gridlocked, I walked to my Capitol Hill apartment. I had no information suggesting that the attacks were over. Sheltering in place or even complete evacuation of Washington, D.C. were conceivable. I stocked up on supplies at the corner store, packed a go bag, watched TV, and waited. Late in the day, as the phone lines started to clear, I left voicemails for my mother, my grandparents, and my fiance, all 1,000 miles away, telling them I was safe. The next morning, back at work, the shock had worn off. I felt deep anger. I felt deep sadness for all who had died so terribly, trapped in descending hijacked airliners, crushed by rubble, or burned alive in the towers. I felt deep sadness for the loved ones of the dead, the injured, and the missing. I felt some fear too. I worked at a terrorist target. The power of my feelings alarmed me, frankly, but I didn't have time to deal with them. My priorities as a national security professional were my duties to the senator, to the Congress, and to the country. Congress reconvened. In a frenetically busy time, Congress authorized the use of military force, provided $40 billion in emergency funds for recovery and war, passed the USA Patriot Act, and created the Department of Homeland Security. A few days after 9/11, a senior colleague from another office and I hurried past each other in the hallway. I asked how he was, to which he, red-faced and angry, barked something like, "We need to round them up, all of them, all the Muslims, all the Arabs." I was stunned to hear this awful endorsement of a repeat of one of the most terrible moments in our nation's history, sending innocent Japanese American citizens en masse to American concentration camps during World War II. That moment, together with many other ugly moments of bigotry against Muslim Americans and Arab Americans nationwide, signaled that the death and the fear that al-Qaeda had brought to us on 9/11 had awakened something monstrous inside our body politic. September 11 didn't seem to end with the arrival of October. There was a report made public on October 11th that al-Qaeda may have smuggled a nuclear warhead into New York. I knew there was a risk of unknown severity. For several years, I'd helped the senator legislate and write about the danger of loose nukes in the former Soviet Union, including al-Qaeda's interest in them. Thankfully, the October 11 report proved false. Not long after, I joined a long line of congressional staff one chilly morning to get my nasal passages swabbed. The mood was by turns lighthearted and grim. A second terrorist attack in the form of the bioweapon anthrax had sickened and killed people after being mailed to journalists in New York and to the Capitol complex. The letters referenced Allah, and of course, most people suspected al-Qaeda. Years later, it turned out probably to be the work of a deranged government lab worker impersonating the 9/11 plotters. I tested negative for anthrax, and a few days later, I stood in the crowd at a U2 show in the DC-Baltimore area. The singer, Bono, embraced an American flag as one holds a wounded child. The feelings I denied myself overwhelmed me. The emotions in that arena that night were unbelievably raw and intense. Thousands of us who had lived through the attacks sang, danced, and embraced. Many openly wept. It was amazingly cathartic. Other bright spots that fall were a dramatic reduction in partisan political tensions and a sense among many of common purpose. That unity lasted most of a year until squandered domestically and internationally, when our national leadership marched us into the unnecessary and catastrophic Iraq War. The 20 years since 9/11 have been so tumultuous. September 11 and our nation's response to it have both enhanced security in some respects and fueled successive waves of suffering abroad and at home. The monstrous bigotry evolved and metastasized and is still with us. For my part, I live a life of gratitude. We can never know for sure where or when Flight 93 would have struck, nor who among my Capitol colleagues and I would have been killed, injured, or spared. We do know that those everyday Americans bravely gave their lives for others. We must never forget. I think about the heroes of Flight 93 every time I see our beautiful Capitol. I give thanks to them so often when I am with my daughter. She was born many years later into our imperfect but blessed land of liberty, security, and the rule of law. Because of the sacrifice, service, and everyday effort of so many in our country, in a world of unfathomable evil and darkness, she walks in light.
My name is Salah Aziz. I'm a professor of law and Chancellor Social Justice Scholar at Rutgers University Law School, and also the founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. On 9/11, I was a first-year law student at the University of Texas in Austin. I went to law school with a very focused objective, which was to focus on human rights, rule of law, and democracy in the Middle East, and particularly in my country of birth, Egypt. I was very upset about the authoritarian practices that had infected the region for decades. And I believed that I could work with the civil rights lawyers, the human rights lawyers, and the indigenous advocates to support them, because I thought I would get the training as an American lawyer focused on international law and human rights to be able to add some value. But within weeks of starting on that path, the Twin Towers were attacked by 19 people who identified as Muslims and claimed to be acting in the name of my religion, which I reject. And as a result, my entire career trajectory changed, because I and my family and my communities, Muslim communities of different ethnicities and national origins, experienced an existential crisis. Overnight, we went from being a relatively invisible minority. We were racially liminal, meaning that people really didn't know what we were. It depended on the context. Most people thought I was Latina because I was in Texas. Sometimes they thought I was Brazilian or biracial. Most people did not know that the name Aziz was Middle Eastern because they just didn't know the different Middle Eastern names. And therefore, the discrimination that Muslims experienced before 9/11, which they did experience, tended to be more individualized based on what they looked like, whether they wore the hijab, what particular city or community they lived in, and their socioeconomic class. But what happened after 9/11 is that all of us were presumed to be guilty. It didn't matter who you were, what you looked like, or what you believed in. If the American public thought you were Muslim, whether you were or not, you could be a Sikh American, then you were suspicious. You were presumed disloyal. At best, you were a sympathizer with the 9/11 hijackers. At worst, maybe you even knew about it or helped in some way. And that is a huge shock to one's sense of identity and one's sense of safety. And it had very real material consequences for my family, for my community in Dallas, which is where I was raised, among a relatively devout Muslim community. We went to the mosque every week. We participated in fundraisers to give charity to children in Gaza and the West Bank, in Bosnia and Iraq, because the US sanctions was starving the population. And we thought that that was our religious duty to give charity. We had no interest whatsoever in terrorism. We saw all the conflicts as causing, a lot of poverty and hardship. And we also presumed that we were protected by the First Amendment and that Americans lived out what they taught themselves and all of us as Americans in schools, which was this was a land where religious freedom was taken very seriously, where people who were persecuted based on their religious identity from different countries would have come here for asylum or refuge, and that of all rights, religious freedom was one of the most privileged rights. And so after that day, everything changed, and I was like the 5 to 7 million at the time. It was probably 3 to 5 million Muslims. Every time we turned on the television, it was showing Middle Eastern looking men as terrorists. It was showing the Twin Towers being hit over and over again. It was showing the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq for years. And we would hear things that were so offensive and so hurtful about our religion, about our identities. And we felt helpless. We felt that how can we get people to understand that the Taliban is a very small, particular political group in a particular context in Afghanistan, and Hezbollah and Hamas and Al-Qaeda and later ISIS. These are very specific political problems that the vast majority, 99.9% of the 1.5 billion Muslims in the world reject, right? So what I ended up doing was becoming a lawyer who defended the civil human rights of people in the United States and defending the rule of law here in the United States.
Hi, my name is Colleen McMahon, Arts and Sciences 73, and I am a senior United States District Judge in the Southern District of New York. Well, I was working in the federal courthouse in White Plains, New York on 9/11, and that was about 20 miles north of the World Trade Center. I was at my desk at 9 in the morning when my permanent law clerk, Jim O'Neill, barged into my office and without so much as a how do you do, turned on the television set. I could not believe what I was seeing. Flames pouring out of a very high floor of the North Tower of the World Trade Center. And within minutes, we saw a plane flying into the South Tower. I was far away, but the event had an immediacy for me because you see, Jim lived at 35 South End Avenue, right across the street from the towers. And his wife and 2 babies were there in a 35th floor apartment. Lorraine called us in the office. Cell phones were not ubiquitous in those days. She called our landline from hers. And she asked Jim what to do. He told her to get out of the building and head south toward the Battery, which turned out to be exactly the wrong thing to say, but we wouldn't know that until later. We stayed glued to the television with no way of knowing what was happening to this young family. When the South Tower fell, Jim collapsed on the floor of my office. The United States Marshals arrived to order us out of the building, which, like all government buildings in the metropolitan area, was being evacuated. But I told them I would not leave until Jim left, and we could not go anywhere until he heard from Lorraine. So he and I and my other 2 law clerks who lived in Manhattan and couldn't get anywhere remained in place for another 2 hours. We watched the second tower go down and we cried and we prayed until the phone rang. And we learned that Lorraine and the babies, one in a stroller, one in a baby Bjorn, had gone south, but were told by the authorities to head back north, which put her right back across the road from the South Tower when it fell. And the panic and the swirl of the dust and confusion, the stroller broke, and she was paralyzed with fear and couldn't move. And in one of the thousands of random acts of kindness that occurred over and over on that hellish day, a large African-American woman appeared at her side, said, "Honey, you are coming with me," picked up young Jack out of the broken stroller, grabbed Lorraine's arm, and pulled her out of the cloud of dust and a mile uptown to an apartment in Greenwich Village, where the family O'Neill was able to call us with the news that they were safe. And there they stayed until the subways started running again, and Jim contrived a way to get into the city, which was closed to entry at every point, and to get his wife and children out of Manhattan to safety. Dr. James Clark was a surgeon at New York Hospital, and they stopped everything. They went into their emergency drill and they stood there. And as Jim said later to me, and stood there and stood there and wondered, where are the people? And nobody came. And of course, that was the night when our mayor told us that the number of people killed would be more than any of us would be able to bear, which is true. Went to the site, I probably 6 or 8 weeks later, as a VIP, and rode around the site on a golf cart. It was still being cleared. And I was astonished at the number of workers who were not wearing a mask, apropos of things that are very real to us today, 20 years later. They were not wearing masks. And no one was suggesting that they wear masks. And I can't tell you how many lives I believe would have been different and would ultimately have been saved if all of those workers had been required to wear masks. But the air in Lower Manhattan at Thanksgiving, the air all the way up to Greenwich Village was still smoky. You could smell the smoke. You could smell the smoke for months. It was, and the weather was glorious. There has never been a more beautiful day than September 11th, 2001 in New York City. And day after day after day, all fall, the weather was beyond glorious, but you could smell the smoke. I think if people are honest, they will tell you that on September 11th and September 12th, nobody in New York was thinking about the future. We were stunned, we were scared, and the future was the farthest thing from our minds. So my honest answer is I had no idea what the future would hold, and at that moment didn't much care. It's 20 years later. Would the last 20 years have surprised me? You betcha. In my wildest dreams, it would never have occurred to me that for the second time in my life, my country would involve itself in an unwinnable guerrilla war in a land known to readers of history as the graveyard of empires, a war that in the end had very little to do with 9/11, or that my then 15-year-old son would spend 8 months of his life in that hellhole, risking his life and his mother's sanity on a misguided fool's errand. And I would never, ever have imagined the creation of Guantanamo, the rendition by Americans of people to black sites, the torture, the shredding of the Constitution and the treaties that we wrote and the norms that we created and championed. And I certainly never would have imagined the complicity of the courts in all of it. I thought that was not who we are. If ever an event was proof of the old adage that revenge is a dish best served cold, it's the last 20 years. The immediate aftermath was not a thoughtful time. People were angry and people were frightened, and understandably so. But angry, frightened people don't necessarily make smart decisions. And while I had no quarrel as a citizen with the notion that we were going to find the people who did this, I don't think that we went about it in a particularly sensible way. And the proof of the pudding is how that limited mission evolved into something that is leading to equally horrible outcomes today. I mean, I'm watching it on the news, and so are you. Everything that's going on this week is a product of that day. For the same reason that Ohio State students today and forever should study history as a whole, because the lessons that you learn from history are invaluable in interpreting what you should be doing on a going forward basis. I hope that Ohio State students will look with a critical eye at the immediate decisions that were made, at the long-term decisions that were made, at how various agendas came to intersect, and to create a much broader and ultimately disastrous war than the initial mission. I hope, as I hoped when I was an Ohio State student and we were in Vietnam, that the next generation and the generation after that will take lessons from those experiences. One of the hardest things for me as a member of the 60s, 70s generation, one of the hardest things for me to accept and to understand is how little we seem to have learned from the historic events of my youth. And I hope you all will do better.